Our next session specifically tackles questions of the sort of unique challenges that Black media makers face in editing, writing about, covering, telling stories about activism, particularly Black activism and protest, both historically and contemporarily. And obviously right now, one of the main issues of that is questions of police and policing. And both of our, two of our panelists actually have written or worked on particularly provocative things on the question of objectivity and the ways in which Black media makers might be held to or limited by what are really sort of weaponized ideas of objectivity. So I want to introduce our panelists and then we'll jump right into questions. Our first panelist is Chenjerai Kumanyika. He's the co-host of the Peabody Award-winning podcast Uncivil and a collaborator of the podcast Seen on Radio. He's contributed to a range of other outlets as an artist, journalist, and he's a professor at Rutgers University's Department of Journalism and Media Studies. His research and teaching focuses on the intersections of social justice and emerging media in the cultural and creative industries. Welcome, Chenjerai. Next up, we have
real excited to be here.
Yes. Next up, we have Stacy-Marie Ishmael. She is the editorial director of the Texas Tribune. Prior to moving to Austin, she was a senior editor at Apple and the managing editor for mobile at BuzzFeed News and the vice president of communities at the Financial Times. Welcome, Stacy. So great to have you. Thanks for joining us. And then we have Wesley Lowery, who is a journalist at CBS News. He's formerly at the Washington Post, where he led the Post's Fatal Force Project, which won the Pulitzer Prize for National Reporting in 2016. And he's also the author of They Can't Kill Us All, Ferguson, Baltimore, and a New Era in America's Racial Justice Movements. Thank you so much for joining us, all three of you. I feel like this is, well, the last panel was an all-star panel, and now we have another all-star panel. I think that's probably the theme for today. So I want to jump right in because as you saw in the last panel, these go really quick. People have so much great stuff to share, and we get so many great questions that we want to make sure we're able to tackle everything. And of course, you know, we may not get to it all, but certainly want to jump in. So 2020 was both a remarkable year in a lot of ways. The pandemic is perhaps what made us most remarkable, but in many ways, as the previous panel noted, it was a repeat of others in that we saw an uprising for Black lives, we saw more cases of police brutality, and perhaps it looked different in some ways than at other times. The outrage around police violence is certainly not new among Black communities and in Black centered media, but has increasingly become sort of newsworthy in mainstream media. So I'm wondering if you could each, to start out, share how in your particular roles, you've approached telling stories about that intersection of police and policing and activism and activists. And we can go in any order you want.
Wes, do you want to start?
Yeah, I can do that. So it has been really interesting, and it's been interesting to watch stretching from 2012, 2013 through today, so almost a decade, to watch this story and storyline kind of continually be in the domestic conversation and to watch the mainstream media in various different iterations have to grapple with it. I think that one of the things, you know, I spent a lot of time covering these issues and writing on them. And one thing I'll say is I think a lot of the coverage is not very smart. I think that changes over time and there's improvement, right? But I think that, you know, Nicole Hannah-Jones always says that people like to underestimate the extent to which issues of race are an expertise. And to write off the expertise within newsrooms and within that. I would also note that, you know, criminal justice is a public policy space that also requires a level of expertise. And so I think because of that, anytime we in the media cover something as purely as news, a thing that is happening today that we can throw any reporter at, they can just write down the stuff and we can move on, it leads us to coverage that is wanting, right? That if tomorrow a group of climate scientists put out a new paper, I should not be the one to write that up. Not that I am not a journalist, not like I haven't covered a bunch of different things. It's that I have no expertise in climate science. I don't understand the unique significance here. I don't understand the trends. I haven't been following. And yet, very often when you're looking at issues of law enforcement, when you're looking at issues of race, you see that type of staffing deployed, where this is just a news event to be covered. So whomever is available can get on it and we can cover it as a thing today, as opposed to the latest iteration in a bigger and larger context. I think one of the other things I think that we do too often is we have these conversations almost exclusively and immediately through a political lens. We're seeing this in this very moment because the former president weighed in yesterday on the language of defund the police, right? But when we were looking at criminal justice policy, this is something that plays out in local municipalities across the country. It is not actually a national political issue. And so I think very often we end up having these conversations immediately in a national political context, in a way that we've had more pieces written in the national media about whether or not the words defund the police are good politics. Then we have pieces written from places that have started to defund the police about whether or not they are working.
Right.
Right. We exist in a world where everything is political commentary and there's very little journalism. And what I would argue is, first, one of those things is almost impossible, predicting the future and what's going to work and what's not. The other one, you can just go write down what's happening. I tend to prefer that. But secondarily, we as the media, as an institution, have our foot on the scale. If we write this thing's never going to work and it's never going to work and it's not worth talking about, that influences the outcome, versus a world where we use our journalistic might to more deeply probe these issues. But again, in order to do that, you have to look at these as policy conversations, not politics conversations. And I don't think nationally that's what the collective we does around this.
Yeah, thank you. That's so useful.
So as a person who is responsible for a local, if statewide, newsroom in Texas, which is where some of these conversations are fraught and fascinating, I want to just echo a couple of things that Wesley said, and also throw back to Erin Haynes, who commented at the outset of her story that it was easier for her to learn how to be a political reporter than it has been for political reporters to learn how to cover race. And I think part of it is because of that deprioritization of expertise, right? And the belief that so many of these things do not require study, do not require sourcing up, do not require developing competencies that, to Wesley's point, like if you are going to call yourself a science journalist reporting on climate, like you have to demonstrate slightly more knowledge of the context than is often true for folks who are wading into these issues because they are wading into these issues. And so one of my responsibilities as a person who is now and has been previously in positions to make decisions about who writes what and how we cover those things and how we edit those things, that's something that I am personally and professionally acutely aware of, right? It's like, I know because I've studied and because I've lived, which is not enough, you also have to have studied even if you've lived, that you don't just give anyone this story and you don't, to Wesley's point, treat this like a single narrative, right? You have to allow for complication, and the only way you can allow for complication is if you have the nuance, the expertise, the context, the reporting, the sourcing to do an adequate job of helping people understand the complexity of these channels. I mean, national media organizations love a narrative. Like that's how you become a national media organization, by being able to make sweeping statements that assume like Texas, not less Texas, but New York and California are the world. And to an extent, the outsized power of Beltway reporting is reflective of that as well. Local media organizations have, if not just the responsibility, the opportunity to complicate the narrative and to help people do a better job of understanding that, okay, the former president might be talking about slogans, but here are the facts on the ground of the proportion of budgets that are in question, when folks are talking about defunding the police. Here are the policies that are about to be debated in the legislature that will affect whether any of these things are material one way or another. And I think I am hopeful and optimistic that despite the well-documented peril from an economic perspective in which local news finds itself, we're able to reach our audience and do those things.
Thank you.
Hey, I just want to say, one thing I got to say, this is incredible. And there's so much richness. And this has been such a needed conversation that we probably going to do this again, like soon, because there's a lot that needs to happen. And I'm real excited to be here. Let me just say, one of the things that I noticed about coverage in 2020, and I echoed everything that's been said already, is that I agree with Wesley's comment. Like, you look at a lot of the coverage, and this is not to sort of diss any journalists, but the frameworks, the way we're thinking about activism, the way we're thinking about problems of police and prisons are often not the smartest take. We're in this country, there's a lot of talk about data, things being data informed, right? And we'll get to objectivity, how that relates to that later. But, one of the things I've noticed is that the conversation about data often does not really include historical data, right? Critical historical perspectives and so one of the things about being a scholar in the humanities is that I'm immersed in those kinds of conversations, right? I mean, I get to read from people not only in my discipline of communications, like yourself, Sarah, who's written really smart stuff about social media and activism, but also like, Black women, Black historians. I mean, just so many of the dope historians are Black women. I just got to say that in this area. So what I tried to do in terms of my interventions was to try to add some of that historical context, right? Because what happens when you don't have historical context is that myth about America, myth about policing becomes institutionalized in really subtle ways. It gets institutionalized into language and policy and into these news frames in the ways that the panelists were talking about before. So you can utter a statement as a journalist, like our police systems are broken, and have that be taken as something that is just like a non-biased statement description, when without ever having to say, well, what do you mean broken? Why is that the word? Is the assumption that policing worked is imported through that myth. So I think that our dominant conversation about race, about policing, is a conversation of myths. And the work that's being done by Black media makers is to actually ground it in certain kinds of history. So when I was offered a chance to co-host an episode at The Intercepted, I was like, yo, and also, again, echoing what both Stacy and Wesley said, I'm not. I'm an activist. I'm a student of police abolition, which, by the way, is the tradition in which you will find the smartest, richest historical information about the history of the state, the carceral state, things like this. But I'm not an expert in that. So I said, it was funny. I was talking to Jeremy Scahill, and I said, ideally, I would love to talk to somebody like Ruth Wilson Gilmore. Because she, and I'm talking about, this was now right in the sort of post George Floyd, post Breonna Taylor moment. And I said, but of course, I don't even expect her to have time for that. And he was like, well, I don't know. And so we were able to create a historical intervention actually in that moment, which might be counterintuitive, because another thing about this paradigm and moment of journalism is that things feel so urgent that history seems irrelevant, and I heard Khalil Gibran Muhammad talking about that. So that's one thing. And I think the other kind of intervention I made into trying to understand some of this stuff had to do with, my podcast, Seen on Radio, which is, I work with John Biewen. It's funny, as 2020 started, like literally the day our first episode dropped, which was a series about democracy, right? Asking really, what do we mean when we talk about American democracy? That happened on the day when Trump's impeachment trial was starting. It was so interesting. And so I think that a lot of the interventions are historical. And just one last quick point that I'll make is that the other thing I think that needs to be, really made more rich and critical and more data informed in the way that I'm understanding data, critical historical data, is what the left really is, right? What is Black Lives Matter? Because I think that Black Lives Matter as an idea becomes convenient for journalists to start to just label everybody as Black Lives Matter and not start to pay attention to the nuances. When you're on the ground, in Philadelphia, there's a rich tapestry and ecosystem of organizations. There's 215 People's Alliance, Reclaim Philadelphia, Amistad Law Project is doing incredible work. Black Lives Matter Philadelphia. There's so many, right? And so
in America, there's this web of different organizations.
Absolutely. And so I haven't really seen the media attend to that. There's a tendency to sort of, and then you see the power, right? The authorizing power of news coverage, because what they can do is not really have the nuance that someone like Barbara Ransby brings to that conversation in her book when she talks about, what Black Lives Matter is, right? And then at the same time, they have the ability to authorize who gets to speak. So those are the kind of interventions that I was trying to sort of contribute to in my small way, but that's what I see going on.
Gosh, yeah, I appreciate all three of you so much, because I, of course, as somebody who studies race and activism, I feel this way all the time, which is that there's often historical context excluded and a set of expertise excluded. It seems sometimes like anybody can write about activism, even though they don't actually understand about how movement demands, like, for example, defund the police, work in sort of an activist ecosystem. And so then you get all this attention, as Wesley was pointing out, about this in a way that is sort of detached from a certain set of expertise about how social movements work, or about the history of policing that Chenjerai mentions. So I really appreciate those interventions. And I know that that's something that Chenjerai has done in his podcast in terms of the history of policing, of social movements, of many other things. And so it reminded me that in May of this year, you all had a great episode of Seen on Radio demystifying and historicizing the idea of objectivity. And this is also something that earlier this year, Wesley wrote an editorial about, in which he argued that the concept of objectivity has failed journalism, essentially. It has failed the American public, but especially has harmed sort of Black journalists and Black stories and other journalists of color. And I think that this question of objectivity, I would love to hear you all discuss it, because it's something that when we're talking about covering police and policing, and when we're talking about covering activists and activism, it is often weaponized against Black media makers in particular. And I'm really curious from each of your roles to hear how you have dealt with that, and what your own takes on this question of objectivity are.
Easy questions, right? I think one of the things that I would start with is the what's been raised, which is that history is powerful, which is why I think people are so terrified of Nikole Hannah-Jones and are actively trying to suppress the work that she is doing. Because the thing about history is, once you get past the version that was like the textbook friendly, written by the victors elements of it, you are confronted with the reality that perhaps you are indeed the baddies. And I think that to me is a different way of thinking about what we tend to call objectivity, which is, if it is a product of what we consider to be the status quo, then it is the default, then anything that is within those parameters is read as objective. And so the weaponization of objectivity is much more about power than it is about, the individual facts that are potentially being disputed, because it is about people who are either not themselves from the status quo, or even if they are not in support of the status quo, demanding a different perspective on what those who are maintaining that status quo, which, as we've discussed in newsrooms, is intensely homogenous, hold to be true, right? Or hold not just to be true, but to be worthy of defending and worthy of supporting. And an example that I've used many times is, we don't generally require wealthy reporters to disclose their, forget bank balances, like their ISAs and their trust funds when they are writing about social policy. But I have seen media organizations require journalists to disclose if they have a family member who's incarcerated. And I have seen media organizations argue, and including people on this call, subject line, your tweets, that your personal experience of something makes you incapable of reporting on that thing. In which is for me a manifestation of, like, people flipped out when the Biden-Harris administration announced an all-female communications team. No one has ever thrown a fit at an all-male board, right? Like, no one has ever suggested, wow, this masthead of 100% white men must not be based entirely on talent and deserving to be there. But the second you confront people with an imagined or actual future that looks different from what they're used to, like psychologically, that's very threatening, right? And I think that the discussion about objectivity is a discussion about power and psychological safety and who gets to feel safe in what contexts and who is sort of perpetually relegated to being the outsider.
Certainly. So I agree with all that. And I think that, one thing I think about, I think there are two different things I think about. I think the first is that in the context of this conversation, there is a broad ignorance of our collective journalistic history that, a lot of folks who study journalistic history note that we are, the working man journalist is fiercely anti-intellectual. We don't like theory and that type of thing. We're these practitioners, right? And so I think one of the false premises here is that the idea of objectivity was ever a journalistic decision as opposed to a capitalistic one, right? The reason American objectivity was created was so that newspapers could sell more newspapers. It wasn't actually purely about the idea of more accurate coverage. That's not to say that people who pursue it now have, false or misleading goals, but I just think it's important for us to understand that when we're interrogating a structure or a thing, it's important for us to understand where it came from, right? Because a lot of times the response is, how could you ever question this? This is how journalism, and it's like, well, no, we did this so we could make more money. We didn't do this because this was the ideal form of journalism. Secondarily, I think I always like to note is that as someone who very publicly critiques and have critiqued the application of objectivity, I think it's always important for me to state, I'm not arguing that our news pages need to become our opinion pages, right? That you can argue, I actually think, when you read what I wrote in the Times, the argument was essentially if this is what objectivity is supposed to be, we've massively failed by all of these different standards, right? And so it's not an argument to get rid of the idea of fairness in journalism, right? It's not an argument to get rid of the idea of writing down true things, but rather it's trying to look at and grapple with the extent to which the ideal and the application, there's a massive gulf between them. And the third thing I'll say is that I think that particularly you see the gulf between an objectivity of work and a standard of the perception of objectivity of the individual. When you look at the creation of the idea of journalistic objectivity, one of the premises of it was that no journalist can be objective. So therefore we will create a process by which we can ensure the fairness of the work, right? It accepted as a premise that the individual journalist has opinions, has biases, that's baked into the system. What we see today is a world in which if any actor, good faith or bad faith, can demonstrate that you have any bias or personal opinion, you can be removed from doing journalism, right? Which seems like the opposite of what the point of a system of objectivity was supposed to be about, right? We're supposed to accept as a premise that the journalist is biased and that they are not objective, which is why we create a system. But instead, what we currently see is a system in which journalists assert their own objectivity. And that if any other journalist can be proven to have any belief or view about anything, then they are now ineligible to do journalism, right? That we see in Pittsburgh, one of the more egregious examples, two Black journalists removed from coverage of protest, one for telling a joke about protest damage and the other for retweeting it, right? Not for any failure of fairness in journalism they actually produced. And I think that that's extremely important, right? That look, if someone is found to be doing work that is unfair, I think that's a separate question than the idea that any of us would expose the obvious reality that we all have opinions of things. And I think that there's just a calibration in the highest realms of journalism that has not happened. The reality is we live in a world today where we know more about individual journalists than has ever been true before. There's more, and there's a flattening of public and private expression in a way that is different that has existed previously. And I just don't think our industry has grappled with what that means and what that looks like. And in the meantime, you're seeing women queer folks, Black people, immigrants being disproportionately affected by an outdated and inefficient standard that's being applied to them much more so than anyone else.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would just, again, I echo what's been said. I mean, I really want to underscore the point that for me, in this moment where it's kind of, sort of like it feels tense to talk about, to balance the need for perspectives, from different kinds of experiences. I just want to come down and say, I think objectivity is important. I think what has been happening at news organizations is actually not objectivity. One of the things when I'm working with students and when I'm working with younger journalists and when I'm working with activists, I say, yo, this is the thing. I'm like, we have better facts than them, but you gotta learn how to make empirical claims in ways that bring in those experiences. But I do think that what we're dealing with is a situation where we have better facts. The 1619 Project is a better historical document than what most Americans have gotten in their education. Humbly, I've been told that some of the work on Uncivil and with radio, people say, why wasn't I taught this? What they're saying is the stuff is better facts. And that's not an opinion. That is not some kind of historical opinion that we're offering you. A feminist history is not an opinion. Sort of history that takes into account disability struggles and disability activism is not an opinion. That's a more robust and precise history than what we've had, more objective, more truth. So that's the first thing. And I want to say that, again, a lot of those insights actually about how to balance the particular, right, with the more, empirical, thing that everyone sort of can see, come out of like the Black feminist tradition has commented on those things in rich ways. I know that, things I try to bring when I teach research methods, because again, I'm more a scholar learning from journalists like Stacy and Wesley, and Jean and everyone else, right? So it's like, but the Black feminist tradition, right? The personal is political, right? How you go into someone's personal experience and draw out structures, right? Structures of oppression, things that are actually going on that can be absolutely objectively verified. It must be, right? Also, as Wesley said, in the Black history of the Black press has always had to have a normative assumption because the Black press existed even long before the Civil War happened, right? So it was clear we're not writing newspapers just to kind of, just for kicks. We writing to give freedom, right? So there's a normative assumption, but we're still grounding it in objective reality of slavery. And so I just want to say, in my work, I've tried to bring that objectivity in through history, because I think history gives us a common text that we can reflect on. But I just want to shout out one really thing as we're talking about Black media. When I first started to write for NPR, I was really embraced first by Transom organization, but then by Alicia Montgomery, and by some women at NPR, and including Tasneem Raja. They really helped me as somebody who's not a journalist learn how to write for these media. And what they did was they really showed me the thing that I think Stacy and Wesley and so many of the people we're gonna hear from today are so good at, which is how you can take your experience, Chenjerai, and make claims that you can defend against anybody, right? Objective claims, but then also bring in your take on it so that we get to see whatever value your experience brings. And that training, which really took the shape of editing sessions, right? I mean, it gets kind of wonky. I know people may not want to think about editing as like an exciting site of activism, but it is, I mean, that ability for folks to get in there, in a document and say, Chenj, rewrite this sentence. What do you mean there? Really draw it out. That is really, to me, a site of ideological struggle where we start to make stuff that is, and be able to bring these truths across in ways that we can defend. So I just think that's really important. I want to shout out that mentorship.
Yeah, that's so great. I mean, the things that you all just shared remind me so much of a recent conversation I had with my book agent, and we were talking about this concept of objectivity. And I said, to me, what Black media makers do and have been committed to, as you noted, since before the Civil War with, Freedom's Journal and other abolitionist newspapers, is a tradition of truth telling. And I think when we say objectivity, some people who are idealizing it hear truth telling. And what we all are saying here, I think, right, is that truth telling is good and we're all on board for this. And that the problem seems to be that, it's a double problem, that historically the only truth that was told was a truth of whiteness and white supremacy, and that was considered true. But that also it's sort of slid into this both-siderism, that you're supposed to tell both sides of the story, even if the facts, as Chenjerai points out, don't support both sides of the story. And so I really appreciate you all saying that. So, I mean, I think on that question of sort of like what the facts support or what is going right or wrong, I'd love to hear from you all about what you think has improved and what you think still needs to be improved in terms of how media institutions particularly are covering Black activism. You know, I mean, yeah, Stacey's like, oh, a lot. Well, because, you know, as someone pointed out, I think it was Aaron in the first panel, you know, the Kerner Commission so many years ago gave journalists an instruction on how to better cover Black communities. But within that, there's this specific question of Black uprisings, Black resistance, Black activism. And we've had so many instances in years to try to get this right. I'm wondering, are folks getting anything right? What needs to be done better? And from your perspective, do you think that the Black journalists are doing something that others should emulate in terms of covering activism?
Just gonna take a deep inhale. Okay. One of the most interesting things that happened in the aftermath of the nationwide George Floyd protests, and then increasingly also for Breonna Taylor, is media organizations sent white photographers and reporters out to cover these protests. And those photographers and editors were confronted with violence. And they were confronted with the reality of police saying that they did or did not do a thing that those reporters and editors had witnessed them do or not do with their own eyes. And, you know, you had big examples like it was definitely not tear gas, except that it was. You had smaller examples. And suddenly, the thing that had for a long time been the domain of a small group of people with less kind of power and capital in newsrooms saying over and over again, one of them is on this panel, was no longer deniable. And it was very interesting that as soon as that happened, the tenor of the coverage just like changed, right? It went from, not everywhere, but it went from the default of these violent protesters were met with reasonable force to like, what the hell is the NYPD doing? Like, why are they driving into people? And like, how come, you know, San Diego sheriffs are saying that they didn't arrest a reporter when like 4 camera crews were literally there filming this reporter being arrested? And it was almost as if like a nationwide media light bulb went off that we need to treat official sources, including the police, with the same degree of skepticism and rigor that we have always been told to treat, oh, well, this is an activist or this is an advocate, so they're gonna come at this from a certain angle. Like that notion of you can believe the police statement because it's the police statement was like really, really tested. And I think that just like that happening was like a tremor that has affected newsrooms in all different kinds of ways. And I think it has in fact benefited the coverage around, you know, 8 Can't Wait or 8 to Abolition or Defund the Police, because the assumed premises of that conversation have really changed because of the people who like suddenly had to see the world very differently.
Yeah, absolutely. And the frustration of the fact that Black journalists and Black media makers and ordinary regular Black folks were saying that. They were saying, hey, maybe question the police narrative. And it wasn't until certain sort of bodies were victimized in those spaces that it became the norm. I mean, I know Wesley has a lot to say about this particular subject.
Well, and I think that one of the reasons is, and I think we underestimate, you know, when we have a conversation about objectivity, when we have a conversation about the collective perspective in journalism, right, we can't escape the reality that the norm within journalism is a white perspective, that the vast majority of people in our newsrooms are white, that the hyper vast majority of people making decisions, masthead editors, but also assignment editors and section editors, are white, right? And that when we look at any issue in the country, but specifically when we look at interaction with the police and criminal justice, we have in aggregate racialized experiences with the police. That I think there was a recent poll that found something like 75% of white people, the last time they had an interaction with the police is because they themselves called the police, like that it was a purely positive interaction, while something like 50 or 60% of Black people, the last time they had an interaction with the police was completely negative and not voluntary, right? That we experience the police in completely different ways. And because of that, it primes us to come into these interactions, to these stories, to these interviews, to these headlines with different assumptions of the capacity of the police to be good, to be bad, to interact, right? And so again, what we very often see in mainstream media is a majority white, a functionally white news organization that is writing from a white perspective for an assumed white audience and what's palatable to their perspective, now having to cover what Black people are saying about the police, right? And so you see how there then ends up being a breakdown in these things. What I will say also, though, is even as I think that there's some, I agree completely with what Stacy-Marie is saying. I think that unfortunately, I find this to be kind of cyclical, right? I remember when myself and Ryan Riley got arrested in Ferguson, and suddenly like the media was all very woke about how could you do this to a journalist, blah, 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 right? Even though there were hundreds of Black people in Ferguson getting arrested on nonsense all the time. And frankly, I think myself and a colleague at the Post I believe, I don't want to erase anyone's work, are the only journalists who ever followed up on all those arrested people in Ferguson. We did a big piece about like that the reality is the media is not or should not actually be some protected class of people. If the police are treating us some way, that should not just make us mad because it's happening to us, but rather it should raise a question of how are they treating other people who are less privileged than us. And I don't know that we always do that. I also think at times there can be a narrative over correction. And what I mean by that is I don't think it is productive or accurate for us to, on cable news, be standing in front of a burning building talking about the peaceful protest. I think that harms our credibility. I think that too often in media, we are forced into binaries, or we force ourselves into binaries that the real world doesn't exist in. Right? You cannot describe a set 7 hours of protest by disparate groups, some organic, some not, as either quote peaceful or quote violent. That's not actually, as anyone who spent any time at a protest knows, that's not how it works. And yet we accept as a premise that we can do one or the other. And I think that is a mistake very often. That the truth exists in nuance and messiness and complication. And I think that we do ourselves and the journalism a disservice when we insist that we're going to be caught in these very specific paradigms. Either this was peaceful or it was violent. Either this was justified or it was not, right? And in fact, we see this happen very often, and it results in journalism that is not actually fully accurate. And that cuts in a lot of directions. And so I think that that's really important as well. I think that, and like I said, to go back to a point I made earlier, beyond that, we have to look at these issues as issues of expertise, right? We're not that far removed from George Floyd, from Breonna Taylor, from Rayshard Brooks, and yet we are not seeing consistently much intelligent journalism around these spaces. At this point, we're still within the same calendar year, right? The story hasn't, we're not a year later, we're not 2 years later. We're seeing very little smart analysis and journalism of what's actually happening within these protest movements, what's actually happening within these police departments. You had any number of departments and places say they were going to change well, I have no idea whatever happened to that because no one's ever written about it again. And so I think that we do we the media create most of our journalism when the least amount of information is available, and very little journalism when the most amount is available, right? Sometimes if you wait and exhale and let some stuff actually happen, suddenly there are answers to questions, you can figure things out. The person who wouldn't return your call before because they were inundated now is available. And I think on these issues particularly, we see a massive gulf, a massive lack of follow-up, a massive lack of like intellectual challenge with the journalism that we're given. These stories are covered when the street is literally on fire. And when the fire's put out, we move back to politics all day, every day. When the fire's put out, we move back to whatever this other, and we don't actually engage these issues in smart, intelligent ways, which, by the way, is why so much of the commentary on this is so idiotic, because there's not even smart journalism on it, right? The take people just read stuff and then regurgitate it. But if we're not writing smart stuff in the first place, it's hard for them to regurgitate anything smart.
Mm.
I'll try to be brief because I know we want to get to our, some Q&A, yeah, bring the audience in. And also, I'm not the expert in service to on this particular one. I just want to say a few things. One is, when we talk about what's going right and wrong, I mean, I think I've definitely seen more smarter coverage over the past couple months. But I just want to say, like, I'm somebody who often is critiquing journalism. I want to make sure we shout out those folks who are there, really trying to do a good job. That's one of the great things about this whole event, is that we get to lift up such people. I would say, if you want to see some really interesting examples of people who are doing this stuff in different ways, I facilitated a discussion with 3 journalists of color: Tuck Woodstock, Emily Dugdale, and Matt Harvey from Chicago, works with Tribe. That was hosted on a Third Coast Festival. So if you go to Third Coast, you could probably see that whole thing. But I just want to build on something that Jean said earlier. All the things being talked about make me think about what kind of infrastructure and capacity are built into newsroom and journalistic outlets, right? And media institutions. And you did see a rush in the wake of all this stuff of like institutions wanting to find ways to address what they were missing, right? My friend Amber Phillips and my friend Sabella were having a conversation, and they were like, I feel like white folks is suddenly trying to cram on race. You know how you're trying to cram the last minute before the exam real quick? And they're like, oh my God. So all these pieces coming out, racial cramming, but that shows what's not there. But sometimes the way that these things are remedied are through like budgets that are temporary, positions that are temporary, like diversity positions. And so across the country, you have some folks of color and some people who have some different insights, but it's not built into a way that's going to be scalable, as Jean said. And so, and I think that, and also the mentorship, because sometimes you could take somebody who's like, you find any person of color in your organization or any, and just try to suddenly put them in charge of a massive project without the support, right? So for those reasons, I think it could be that some of the most radical moments in solving this happen when we're discussing budgets, right, at media institutions. And not just budgets in terms of how we're going to support and create an infrastructure, but also, capitalism, right? Like, can a capitalist media market really support the patience, the time, the kind of infrastructure that we need to build in to do this? And I think we know the answer is no.
Yeah. Thanks. That's so great. I do want to save the last 15 minutes here for some questions, and I already have a couple lined up that I'm hoping we can answer live. So I want to start with this question from my colleague Barbie Zelizer, and there's also a follow-up from my colleague LaCharles Ward related to it. Thanks for your fantastic contributions. Of course, we all feel that way. So I echo the need to move toward activism as it connects to journalism, but it's fair to say that activism has long been a part of the journalistic mindset in non-US locations. Considering Aaron Haynes's earlier comment that, quote, race is the unfinished work of our democracy, could an argument not be made that US journalism might not find its reset through democratic principles? And then LaCharles followed up and said he wants to echo that question. What are the limits to the line of thought that journalism can find or should expect their reset to happen through appeals to normative democratic principles?
I think the first thing that I would say is activist journalism also has an incredibly long tradition in the United States, yeah, right? So I want to make sure that we don't elide the reality of a place that gave the world Ida B. Wells, and various folks who like went undercover in different contexts to expose certain things. I also don't think that there is an inherent contradiction between small d democratic principles and activism. I don't know that those are necessarily in opposition. I think there is an inherent contradiction between the status quo and activism, which is often what those principles serve to uphold, and as a result, often what media organizations are more inherently comfortable sort of operating within. But I think to, you know, the earlier points about complicating the narrative, I think it's important to be able to interrogate what we mean when we say activism versus advocacy versus journalism, democratic principles versus, you know, revolution and reconstruction. And I think the challenge for me as a person who's been an editor for a long time is always to remind folks that sometimes the mere act of putting something in a story is foundational to somebody else's ability to run with that and use that as ammunition for a cause, right? It's like media organizations love hashtag impact when we can be like, our story was cited in a congressional hearing, or this piece of investigative journalism that we did led to XYZ policies changing. And we are, in certain constrained circumstances, super comfortable with what could reasonably be described as like an advocacy or an activist position, right? Like, you did a thing because you thought a thing in the world needed fixing. And so you devoted some of those budgets to fixing that thing through journalism. And where we tend to throw around the word advocacy and activism is when it's like about things that we are less comfortable with.
Yeah, great point.
Definitely. I mean, Stacy-Marie said exactly what I was thinking. I think there's a massive definitional issue here that you know, I actually think at a foundational, fundamental level, most journalism that's worth doing is a form of activism. You look at what is the Spotlight Project if not activism on behalf of abused children by the Catholic Church, and activism demanding the Catholic Church take hold people accountable. What are, you know, like, and so what is it when the public records guy in your shop sues the state or the police department because he believes the public has the right to certain information? Well, that seems like activism on the behalf of the public's right to know. There are, in fact, people, by the way, who would say, no, the public doesn't have the right to know this, right? This is not some neutral position. It is a position that's being taken. And so I think that there's a massive difficulty, and I think a lot of that comes, frankly, because, again, going back to the anti-intellectualism of the everyday journalist, right? I don't think we have shared definitions of these things, right? And so what is activism is what feels to your white boss like activism, right? Not defined by a certain set of things, not confined to a certain set of parameters, but rather this feels like more than I would feel comfortable doing on this issue or that issue, without people ever actually having to articulate what these words mean, and why this is appropriate or why this is inappropriate. And I think that again, disproportionately harms folks who have a different sensibility than the decision makers in the industry. And we know demographically who those folks are and who those decision makers are.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, real quick, I just would jump in and say, you know, I forget all the parts of the initial question that got answered, but I heard the phrase, race is the unfinished work of our democracy. And, you know, I would like to just recommend an edit to that, which is that American democracy was specifically designed to exploit race and to oppress racialized bodies, you know, for purposes of empire. And so in that light, right, when we talk about activism, we could also say that, like, the journalism that has happened for most of this country's history by mainstream journalism was activism. It was white supremacist activism, right? I mean, it was a literate silencing of certain kinds of perspectives deliberately. You know, it was patriarchal activism. So there's a way in which we call things activism when people are pushing back, but the mainstream is not looked at as the kind of activist project that it has been. Now you can't say that about the White House anymore because the activism is so explicit. But I just wanted to make that quick point.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It harkens back to Stacy-Marie's mention of Ida B. Wells, of course, right? Which was like, of course, the segregated white press's choice to constantly justify lynching was a form of activism. So when she starts telling the truth, the objective truth, right, about the fact that the reason Black men are being lynched and Black women and children is for economic reasons and because of racial resentment, she's understood as the activist journalist. And even those of us who celebrate her and lift her up still frame her that way. And yet I think sometimes we fail to acknowledge that she's doing the version of objectivity that in fact the sort of white supremacist activist journalism that you're talking about, Chenjerai, was trying to undo. So that's a fantastic point. Thank you for that. I want to get to this question. Please forgive me for bringing the defund back in, but we have a question from Anita Varma, and since this is sort of the hot topic of the week because of you know who having an opinion about it, the maybe second most famous president right now, she asks, what advice would you give journalists who are reluctant about even acknowledging the idea of defunding the police in their coverage? For folks within journalism who view, for example, people like Biden and Obama as thought leaders who have said that they don't think it's a legitimate idea, right? Who would you like them to also view as thought leaders and legitimate sources to expand the frame of how defund the police is represented and understood? And I'll let you all decide how to tackle that.
Can I say something? Should I jump in quick on this? One thing I want to say is, I think that's a great question. I know we're like, maybe some people are exhausted of the question already, but I would say like, it's important to attend to the actual language that someone like Obama used. He didn't say thought leaders, he said people. Maybe this is not what the questioner is asking, but I want to be crystal clear. When Obama was talking about who would not like the term defund the police, he said you lose people. And it's interesting how the code word for particular demographics has become people. Like literally someone's humanity as a person. People are, the people that don't like defund the police are people. The people who, like Cori Bush, who was literally elected on that platform, and the people, the constituencies that put her in that position, they are not understood as people, because we certainly can't say we're losing them. Yeah. So I just want to that idea of people. We talk a lot about the slogan. People are like, oh, it's a slogan, it's a demand, but I want to focus in on who are people when we talk about people.
I generally, and I say this as an editor, if somebody comes to me and politicians are their only sources, I have like a question about the reporting, right? Like that story is not done. I would also say that, and this comes from, I started as a finance reporter and I am a huge fan of following the money. Like, what are we talking about here, right? It's like, what are the bills? What are the budgets? Who are the people? Like, what are the salaries? How much of it is incredibly militarized equipment? How much of this is things that are, is police funding affecting the ability of that state or that municipality to provide like mental health services from trained professionals, right? You know that one of the biggest things that folks have been trying to help people understand is you call 911, you're expecting somebody who's a trained crisis counselor, and you get somebody who like has a gun and has no expertise in how to de-escalate a mental health situation. And I want to go back to kind of Wesley's earlier point, which is sometimes starting from the rhetoric is like really, really reduces your worldview, right? Because you're kind of limiting the possibility of the reporting to being incredibly reactive versus kind of zooming all the way back out and saying like, where did this discussion start? Why is it happening? Who are the players? Who are the interest groups? And what is the money that we're actually talking about? And what is the potential of budgets, as it were, to really reframe this conversation? And I find that people, both find financial and economic reporting to somehow be separate from political reporting, which is frankly wild when you look at like the numbers spent on lobbying, etc. And two, unsexy, right? It doesn't seem to be an area that people are willing to, file those public records requests for, even though so much of what we're talking about in these stories comes down to what actual dollars and cents are in question and who is making the decisions about how to spend those things.
Exactly. I actually think that, if you're writing about defund the police and Barack Obama or Joe Biden's name is appearing, I would suggest that we've lost the plot at some point. Neither of these people are experts on American policing. Neither of these people have ever overseen a local budget or a police budget. They are just talking heads on this. this is political noise. This has nothing to do with the actual core issue, right? If the debate in the United States is whether or not the police should receive more or less funding, our job as journalists should be to interrogate how much funding they're receiving, where that funding is going. This should prompt a new, fresh wave of investigative journalism about the American police. Instead, it's prompting a million pieces about what Barack Obama says about it, or what Jim Clyburn says about it, or what it's all, again, one of our biggest issues in media is that everything is politics. I pick any of your cable channels right now, and I guarantee what they're talking about right now is politics. Whether or not the thing they're talking about has any bearing on anything that matters, it all theoretically matters, right? The latest Trump tweet theoretically matters. But certainly there is actual news happening somewhere, right? Like something is actually happening that people need to find out about, right? And I think we've allowed so much of our journalism to be dictated by national politics that we end up not doing journalism that matters, right? How do you, so Barack Obama doesn't like to fund the police. Well, how will he feel tomorrow after our big expose about how the police are wasting all this money and doing X, Y, and Z, right? Our job is not to regurgitate what talking heads say. Our job is to provide new facts into the conversation for them to respond to in the first place. And I think that right, like, I think that is our goal, or should be our goal in terms of doing this journalism, right? There's journalism that codifies or records what has happened, right, or what someone says. And look, I think there's a function that's important. I think we do too much of that. And then there's journalism that brings new information to the fold. And I think on issues like this, that is our job. Ask hard questions, go get the budgets, interrogate the claims, and figure out what happened, right? In the same way that we could have spent 7 years debating, well, are Black people being killed by the police? Are they not? I don't know. Blah, blah, blah. Barack Obama says this is overstated. Who knows? My colleagues and I at the Post went and counted the people, right? And the hope is that then empowers us to have a smarter conversation. And that is, in fact, what shifts the national conversation, as opposed to just regurgitating what talking heads say over and over and over again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's such a fantastic point. Thank you for that. Any closing thoughts? I mean, we're about a minute away from hitting time, and we want to make sure we give folks a lunch break so everyone can get rid of their Zoom fatigue and like look outside and put something in their stomach. But any sort of takeaways that we haven't hit that you all feel are important for folks to be thinking about on these questions?
I would say really quickly, there's, the one thing that did happen after Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and really after the protests, right? Not just after the incident, but after the protest and the particular character of protests, there were many pieces about defunding the police that went into police budgets in Los Angeles and New York and Philadelphia. And so I would encourage people to review that, right? You don't have to be shackled to the pace of media where we can't go back and learn and review. Secondly, Free Press has done something that is incredible called the Media Reparations Project. It's Media Reparations, I think like 2070. And it's an incredible historical report for anybody who might have listened to like Uncivil or seen like or the 1619 Project. It's like the 1619 Project, but of media. And there's all kinds of stuff that I didn't know as a media scholar that was put into that report. And so I would encourage people to get to engage with this, because when we talk about the incentives that we need to make the changes in media, when we talk about the history, what they really lay out is the case for media reparations. I think that's an incredible part of this conversation and a chance to dream something new. So thanks.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. And it looks like Stacy-Marie just shared that in the chat for those who want to take a look at it. This has been so fantastic. I appreciate all of your time and insights so much, and thank you for joining us. I know folks can find you all on Twitter, at your various places, of employment and engagement. And I hope that we can sort of continue this conversation outside of this space. Thank you all so much. And everyone, please go eat. We will be back at exactly 1:15 for our next panel, which is specifically, Wesley, sorry. It's specifically on political reporting. It's on Black media makers who have, of course, been covering the presidential campaign this year and other sort of national policy and politics issues, which is very important. So we hope to see you then.